Hello and welcome to episode 186 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. I'm one of the co-founders here at ETR, and today I am joined by two of the best when it comes to both micro and macro analysis. It is our director of analytics, the master of math, the enemy of Team I Know Better, Mike Leone. First up, Mike, how's it going?
It's going well. It's, a great time of year. We just had the NFL draft. I'm jumping into too many best ball drafts already, so I'm pretty pumped up.
Good. Also on today's program is the reigning champion, the king of the best ball streets, after winning last year's Underdog flagship for $200K. In my opinion, one of the best, if not the best ball players out there. It is Justin Herzig of Establish the Run, of Own the Moment. Justin, how's it going?
Best ball in football. That's what ETR does. That Wedding Crashers video is fantastic.
Oh my gosh. I have no idea if we're making any money by doing all these really cool videos. I would venture to say probably not, but it's damn fun. I mean, and the guys are crushing it. It's so funny. So shout out to all the guys on the video team doing all the input on that. Go back and find the best ball video if you can on the Establish the Run Twitter with Herzig and Leone's face implanted onto the Wedding Crasher stuff. I had to ask you though, Justin, last year you won $200K, as I mentioned, for first place in the Underdog flagship. This year, if you win, which you won't, but if you do, it'll be $1 million. How tilted are you that you got 5X out of you lost 5X?
I peaked too early. I mean, Josh Norris the entire time during the Underdog Palooza was just like, dude, you can get second this time and you're still making more than you did last time for winning it all. But I got to justify there's also probably 5 times as many people in this. Yeah. And we'll get into it. The craziness that had to happen, each step of the way to continue advancing and then win in that final pod. Someone else probably would have had Alvin Kamara too.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. On today's show, we are going to talk about a very, very specific topic. What is the right strategy for beating a best ball tournament, and what is the right strategy for this specific Underdog tournament, which is massive, as Justin alluded to? It's only a $25 buy-in and $1 million to first, 155,000 entries. I mean, this is a really big tournament, and so we talk about different strategies between some of the smallest field stuff that Leone and I were playing in DFS last year versus some of the Millie Maker stuff that Dink was playing and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of differences here we're going to talk about. By the way, if you do not have an Underdog account yet, be sure you use code ETR after your first deposit. Also, before we get into it here today, quick PSA. Wanted to let everyone know that if you had our draft kit last year, the Established Run draft kit last year, it will renew on Monday at $34.99. Just wanted to give everybody a heads up. We have some new perks that I'm actually really, really excited about that we'll be announcing soon in there, and I think you'll like, plus everything you know and love, like Silva's top 150, his tiers, his team-by-team previews, rankings for literally every format, my default rankings, article, basically everything you need continuously updating through week 1. Okay, I want to start with last year, and I want to start with the team that won last year. Maybe it's not as applicable to this year because the tournament is so much bigger, but I'm curious, Justin, do you have the team tattooed onto your arm? Do you remember the team? Do you remember how you drafted it, when you drafted it? Do you remember the structure and what you were thinking at the time? What do you remember about the team and how it got drafted?
Yeah, I was hoping they actually put the team on the championship belt, but instead they just put the winning score. But I do have it, though, imprinted on the back of my brain. It's interesting because it does kind of follow a bit of the strategy that we're likely seeing at least early this season now. So for quarterbacks, I went 3 QB. I went Tom Brady, Matt Ryan, and Joe Burrow. Turns out I ended up with 2 quarterbacks. For running backs, I went with 4. So I went with our hyper fragile. It was Alvin Kamara, Chris Carson, David Montgomery, and Tony Pollard. I'll do tight ends first. So it was just 2 tight ends, Kelsey and Gronk. And then wide receivers, where I grabbed 9 wide receivers. And it was Calvin Ridley, T.Y. Hilton, Tyler Boyd, John Brown, Robbie Anderson, James Washington, Brian Edwards, Kendrick Bourne, and KJ Hamler. And that's a lot of wide receivers. And really, other than my top wide receiver of Ridley and then Robbie Anderson was great value, none of those feel like they greatly stand out. But I think that was the beauty of having the 9, and that on that playoff run, Kendrick Bourne had the Hail Mary. That was very important. KJ Hamler had the huge game with the one big play. That was very important. It was the whole well-rounded team and this kind of structure that we'll talk about that actually probably got me not only to the playoffs, but continuing to advance.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. A lot of these teams that end up with 8, 9, 10 wide receivers is the volatility, Leone. And we've looked at this about the distributions by position. It turns out that, hey, if you have 9 mediocre wide receivers, their distributions look different than a running back's distributions. And therefore, you don't know when they're going to pop off. If you were playing season long, you wouldn't have KJ Hamler in your lineup. And in best ball, that doesn't matter, right? So, like, that's a lot of the stuff we're trying to take advantage here with drafting so many wide receivers, right?
Yeah, I looked at the correlation of ADP to fantasy points scored over the season for running backs and wide receivers, and it's about the same over the course of the season. But then if you look at that correlation of ADP to weekly scoring, it's a lot lower for wide receivers than it is for running backs. And that's part of the reason why a strategy like Justin's works. You take running backs early because there's a higher correlation between their ADP and what they're going to do on a weekly basis and those scores you're going to use. Wide receivers is a lot more volatile. You can make up for the lack of quality with quantity. It's still important to try and get some high-end receivers, but I love that Justin won with this team because it is the epitome of structure over, individual picks, of picking the right plays. And one of the fun things with best ball is you're kind of like everybody matters a little bit more. I mean, sometimes in managed leagues and shallow leagues, you're looking for league winners or bust, so to speak. But the distribution of points is so important in best ball that everyone can, play a role. Mentioned KJ Hamler ends up coming up huge. So this is a team with some guys that I know some sharp analysts that might have laughed me out of the room for taking, these dusty Chris Carson, David Montgomery, T.Y. Hilton, Rob Gronkowski. But it's really important to structure your team in a way that you have like this great floor ceiling combination. Now, obviously things had to hit a very specific way for Justin to actually win with this team, but he gave himself a chance the way he set it up. And even with the 3 quarterbacks, we prefer 2 higher upside quarterbacks if you can, guys with rushing upside, which Justin doesn't have. But he got 3 guys that went a little bit later, so he didn't devote a lot of capital to the quarterback position. And he got guys that were stackable and pretty correlated. And I think he was able to at least single stack. He didn't go crazy with his stacks, but he was able to single stack all 3 of them. Burrow, of course, gets hurt. That stinks. But going back to the floor ceiling distribution stuff, to be able to stack multiple quarterbacks, I think, not only gives you the ceiling, but I think it gives it a little bit more floor than people realize as well. And it's a great combination of you need to make it you just need to get to the finals, in the first place. You need to make it out of the regular season. That's the first key, and stacking helps you do that, but then it gives you that high weekly ceiling once you get out of there and are in the playoff format. Yeah, we're going to talk more about stacking in a second. I wanted to ask about Kelsey. Were you above market on Kelsey? Because I know a lot of sharp people, due to position scarcity, are bumping tight ends or were bumping tight ends up in their rankings to try to get a difference maker there. Were you above market on Kelsey? Do you remember last year, Justin?
I was, but I'm not this year. But above market last year means you were drafting him early second. When, at that turn last year, if I remember correctly, you had to decide between guys like Joe Mixon and such, and a couple of other running backs who didn't love, but they were decent picks. I think Nick Chubb was in that area too. I kind of also often had Kelsey at that beginning of the second. And I think part of that is because I drafted so many of those 3-man leagues where Kelsey was arguably the number 1 draft pick there. And yes, it's a very different setup, but it also kind of triggered my mind for what is this upside role of a tight end and that edge you can get on everyone else? Because yes, there's usually one guy that maybe comes out, that Darren Waller situation that you get that, maybe it was Logan Thomas to some degree last year, the really late guy that performs. But for the most part, it's a lot easier to find a wide receiver or a running back who finds himself in a higher volume role who can perform than someone that's a late tight end that also still has that crazy high upside. And so that's where, I'm a little more hesitant this year because Kelsey's going all the way up to 6 or something. Yeah. But in general, I loved that upside at the 1Z position.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about the team was the hyper fragile. And for people who don't know what we're talking about here, we're talking about only taking 4 running backs, which obviously can go really bad, AKA fragile if one gets hurt or if they bust or whatever. The way to think about it is if a bull case for all 4 or a bull case for 3 happens, you don't need any other running backs. Is that how you think about hyper fragile, and how many of your teams last year did you go with that approach on? Was that a conscious decision to go with the hyper fragile?
Yeah, no, a lot of mine really were. And I tried to think about, okay, so like when a couple things go right on this team, how does this really win? And so on that team, my thought process is, okay, so I'm drafting Kelsey high, probably was mid second, because if I got Kamara, probably around like that 4 spot. So I'm getting a good value on Kelsey. I'm not investing capital there. Okay, I've also got Alvin Kamara. I'm going to then, I grab a couple more running backs later on. And I'm like, okay, so I'm good on tight end. I'm good on running backs if these hit. Now I know that I'm weak on wide receiver, so let me just go for a ton of wide receivers. And a lot of the structure that I really like going for is 2 quarterbacks, 4 running backs, 9 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends. And that allows me 1 additional position for where I'm weak. And I think that's what it was a little weird example last year where I don't love not having a rushing QB. I had, the Matt Ryan and the Tom Brady early on. And I'm pretty sure Joe Burrow just fell to me at a value because that was happening a lot in those drafts. And I liked his rushing upside. And that's where I went against the grain to say, okay, I'm going to grab that 3rd QB that I don't normally do, because I definitely wasn't grabbing a 3rd tight end because I invested in Kelsey. And maybe now this year I'd go for a 10th wide receiver. I don't think I did that often last year because we really didn't, there wasn't much data on it to support it. But that's kind of where my thought process was. And overall, I love the idea of hyperfragile just because end of the day, you need those core running backs. So last year, so many people were doing the no RB strategy or the, grab one and then wait a bunch. And I'm like, okay, let me just hit, because majority of these 3rd round running backs probably aren't going to hit. And, we love James Conner, didn't work out last year. David Johnson maybe started off that way, but really tailed off. And that's fine. But when I have a large enough portfolio, eventually I look into that team that has the David Montgomery, who does actually have that huge end of year. And even Tony Pollard had, I guess, 2 of those playoff weeks without Zeke.
Yeah, Jonathan Taylor was someone that you could bump up in the 3rd, 4th round that fit the strategy really well. I know some of my teams that did well was, Kamara, Aaron Jones, JT out of the gate, and literally only took 3. I don't think I'll do that as much this year. But I do think what's interesting with Justin's strategy, something that I've come around to a little bit more with the hyperfragile running back approach. When I first wrote about it at ETR, I was maybe a little too extreme, taking 3 out of the gate or even 4 in a row and being done. But you actually can structure it like Justin did, where you're taking 1 or 2 kind of early, 1 in the 5th, 6th round, and then an upside guy like Pollard late. And if you do it that way, you get a lot of the same benefits as taking them right out of the gate, because you've got 2 somewhat early that you're banking on staying healthy, more or less. But then you've still got room for the elite tight end in Kelsey. You've got room for the elite wide receiver in Ridley, even though you're going to go a bunch of receivers. It's still nice to have 1 really high upside guy. So it's almost even getting more fragile than when I first wrote about it. Get 1 or 2 guys early, but still only take 4 total.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is the 3rd round running backs and the 5th round running backs, we think we're better at predicting than we actually are. And the difference between those, which is probably ends up being RB20 and RB25 approximately, because you don't have many drafted in that period. But the difference in wide receivers between the 3rd and the 5th is significant, because in the 3rd round, you're getting still a top 8, 10 wide receiver, where in the 5th, it has that bit of a drop. So I think I agree with you there. If I have the ability to grab the number 1 tight end and a top whatever, maybe 10 wide receiver to complement that hyper fragile and not giving up too much, I love that.
The reason Leone just mentioned his hyper fragile article there is because he actually told me his attorneys are going to be in touch with you, Justin. He'd like half of your winnings from last year. So I'll be looking forward to that. Okay. I want to merge.
Quick shout out to Mike Beers, one of the OG best ball guys who was on hyperfragile. Just got to give him some credit. So his attorneys don't also contact me.
It's going to be a class action
on each other's shoulders.
Yeah, it's going to be a class action suit. Okay. I want to merge into this debate of early versus late. When is the best time to draft? Evan and I have done some podcasts for season long where we talked about the advantages of drafting early. I think a lot of people feel strongly that it's better to draft late. I want to merge into it. Justin, do you remember when you drafted the team that won last year? I mean, is there any way to know? I don't even think there is there?
There's not. I was trying to think through who the players were and where I could have, but yeah.
I was wondering if you bought David Montgomery during that dip when people were worried about his injury in the offseason.
I know that I bought a lot of the Tyreek Hill when he was dropping like the 10th, 11th. And in general, my philosophy on this is when a person drops a significant amount when they've already been drafted elsewhere, whether or not I believe that's going to actually, that player's going to have a suspension, injury, whatever it is. If I'm right, I've got a big leg up on the rest of the field who's already been drafting him so early. So when Tyreek Hill was normally going in the second, third round, I'm now getting him in the 10th round. Whether or not he gets suspended, I don't know. I'm not trying to prognosticate on that. But if he doesn't, and he does have a great year, I have an advantage. Antonio Gibson was the opposite. If you weren't getting him in the 14th, 15th, or if you were, you shouldn't start getting him in the 6th, 7th, because if he has a huge year, there's so many other teams that have already been getting him late in the season that you're just kind of starting a leg down.
Yeah, great point. Okay. I know as we get into this here, people are saying, come on, guys, it's May. It's too early. Get out there and get on the team, smell the roses. We don't even have depth charts solidified yet. Dudes are going to get hurt. Why are you drafting now? And honestly, like I said, I can see merit for both sides here. Let me give you guys my rant first, and then I'll let you respond. I would think of this more as closing line value. And a perfect example is the Antonio Gibson thing that Justin just mentioned. But closing line value for anybody who bets sports, I mean, if you bet the Bills -3 and it closes -7, you have absolutely printed money because markets trend towards efficiency over time. And I think the best ball ADP market is similar. Like if you took Will Fuller in May in round 11 last year and he's going in round 5 in August, well, you've won, right? You've won the Sklansky bucks. Same with Chris Godwin in 2019. I think Aaron Jones moved up a couple rounds from this time last year. Adam Thielen, James Conner didn't work out, but he moved up a bunch too. And so, man, when I'm picking up that much value early, I mean, 3, 4, 5, 6 rounds, when I'm picking up that much value early versus what's going to happen later, you need some 666 sick fish in there later to overcome it. And I get that the argument is that there's no casuals drafting right now. There's very few casuals drafting. Everybody knows what they're doing. I don't know about that. As we get later in August and September, I think a lot of people are just going to draft off ADP. Now, they should be using our rankings, but come on, let's be honest. Like, as much as we'd love for everybody to have our draft kit, like that's just not the case. There's just some tiny fraction. So most will just draft off of ADP, but I think that's like reasonably solid, certainly much more solid than the ADP is now on Underdog, which is just a stone disaster. So to me, the value that you can get on players 3, 4, 5 rounds ahead of where they'll go in 4 months is worth it to draft early versus the competition is a little bit tougher now. I don't know exactly how tough it is. I think, honestly, this marketing blitz that Underdog is doing is going to help bring in more and more casual people too. So that's my case for drafting early. I always lean towards drafting early and season long. I think it gives me a better edge. But I know there's disagreements for sure. Does anybody want to present the other side, or do you guys agree?
So I'll start first. And I think your points are valid. And without a doubt, from a player projection standpoint, the ones who are most in the know right now do have an advantage. I think from a player projection randomness aspect, there's also value for if you're just randomly drafting, I don't even want to say Michael Carter because he's kind of going around like pick 100, 110, but maybe Kenneth Gainwell, a very late one, and something happens to Miles Sanders and Kenneth Gainwell ends up being like the starting running back. Like, no, you didn't really project that, but that just happens because there's enough time. That outlier scenario maybe now provides you with a power team going into your league and into the playoffs. Those are valid points. The counter to it, though, is far less about the actual players and more about the competition you're drafting against and from a structure-wise. And this is something we should honestly do an analysis of as I think about it, but I'd love to see the roster constructions of people who draft early versus the couple weeks before the season, because my hypothesis is that the people, and this is just from what I was seeing in drafting, when you look at who's drafting now, you don't have anyone drafting 4 QBs or 4 tight ends, or really even not many 3 QB, 3 tight end. You have people who are, they're into it. They've been ready for best ball. They're jumping in. And from a roster construction pure stance, there's not much dead money. When we get to that month before the season, oh my gosh, this is when there's just all the dead money going. And like you probably see, usually in those drafts, 3 people who they are dead out the gate just because of their roster construction, drafting only 5 or 6 wide receivers. And so I agree with you. From a player projection standpoint, there is value now. And it probably makes sense to have some form of a balanced portfolio across. And gosh knows, it's enjoyable to be drafting now. But from a purely structure, and as Leone said, like my team was successful from the structure, not because of the players that I absolutely nailed. Didn't have the T. Higgins, Justin Jefferson, et cetera. And that's where I see my value in having an edge in the field. And I want to capitalize that edge as we get closer to the season more. So I will draft throughout, but I'll definitely lead majority of mine for as we get close to that season.
Go ahead, Leone.
As Justin's talking about that, that makes me think too, sometimes as fun as it is to focus on like the huge upside you need to win, like a crazy tournament like this, one of the biggest edges is advancing in the first place, like getting out of that regular season. And that's kind of what Justin's speaking to is, you know, maybe someone has more of a quote unquote monster team from drafting earlier, but if the majority of Justin's teams are drafted later, he's probably going to hit on a higher percentage of those even making the playoffs, where crazy things can happen. As Justin will tell you, he was the only one the final week with Alvin Kamara, and he scored 6 touchdowns. So like, it's like 3 uncorrelated tournaments at the end. So there are some things you want to do, which we'll talk about, to like set up for that. But the biggest edge is getting there in the first place. I do still like I'm probably going to draft pretty balanced May through September, combination of fun, combination of taking advantage of some good player ADPs. And also it's a little bit more high variance, right? I mean, as we're recording now, we're a week away from knowing the bye weeks. Like I might have some teams in trouble just on bye alignment, but I'm also going to have some teams where, you know, I've drafted Gerald Henderson and something happens to Cam Akers and I've got like this massive ceiling. What's hard, the other side of the coin to that, I do want to point out though, is it's almost like you have to hit a parlay. Like maybe you get really lucky on the Darrell Henderson thing, but you need the rest of your lineup to get through scot-free, right? In terms of making the team, some of these guys at the back end of your draft. And when structure is so important, you can't really afford to lose guys. You know, if you're drafting redraft, I think the edge in drafting early can be even more maximized, because if you miss on some guys, you can just replace them. But if I lose 2 receivers, you know, in a hyper fragile build, and I'm down to 7 now, I'm in trouble. You know, like even if I get the smash somewhere else. So
yeah,
I see both sides of it. I'm drafting some now. I got, you know, a Burrow triple stack at like a crazy good price that I don't think people are going to be able to get later. So I like having the spread out portfolio.
Also, I'll say 2 things. First, I don't want to hear this bullshit from people about, but I can't draft early. My player might get hurt. Like you're in the same league with everybody else. I don't want to hear that. It's the rules are the same for everybody in your 12-man league. It's just, if you can't deal with like the randomness of stuff like that, I get it, but that's not the right way to think about it. The second thing that I would say is that if you're using our rankings, and by the way, a shout out to us. I mean, our rankings are so far off from ADP right now. And obviously we think ours are so much better and sharper. Like now is the time. I mean, we have guys 30, 40, 50 spots ahead of where they're being taken. And obviously we will regress it to the market a little bit here so that you guys understand where you can get guys. But yeah, I mean, just like simply by using our rankings, I mean, you can have so much of a better team than what you'll be able to get in August and September when the ADPs are more flattened out.
And there may be a dumbbell strategy here where actually the play is, hey, right now, there may be a significant amount of advantage just from our rankings before the ADPs really settle and getting ahead of the game. I mean, Trey Lance is 143 with an ADP right now. Like, holy crap. When he becomes a bit more known that, you know, he's going to be the starter for the majority of the year, if not the entire season, he's going to be a top 100 QB. So like maybe right now there's that big advantage. As things kind of settle, maybe then, like, you know, we lose that advantage if the ADP kind of settles. And then again, right before the season starts. That may be something that I kind of consider a bit more.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move to positional allocation. I think what a lot of people want to know is, hey, how many guys at each position should I take? And it's a bit nuanced. We do have an article on the site that we've done where we talk about exactly what we think in terms of parameters and how we would get to those different parts of the parameters. And so, you know, obviously, I think the easy example that we've already talked about basically is if you take Patrick Mahomes in round 2 or round 3, you only need one other quarterback because your Mahomes is so likely to be counting your lineup every week. And so you probably wouldn't take another quarterback until really late and you only need one more. However, let's say you take, your first quarterback you take in round 11, you're more likely to end up with 3. And so that's how we think about a lot of that stuff throughout the whole positions. Leone, do you want to give people any more parameters, any more nuance besides what we have on the article for position allocation specific to this Underdog tournament?
Yeah, I think for me, we talked about the hyper fragile build, and Justin also mentioned, a dumbbell strategy in terms of when he's going to play. I use the dumbbell strategy at running back where I'll do hyper fragile teams, but I was surprised some of the zero RB teams, like the extreme zero RB teams, did really well and showed a lot of upside last year. And that means you're not drafting a running back really the first 5 rounds. I'll do some of those teams as well, especially early on where it feels like more people are drafting that fragile running back setup we're only taking 4. So I kind of want to zig when other people are zagging. If you're at the end of the first, second round, you can do this and you can get some Josh Allen dig stacks, Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins. You can get some, interesting high upside stacks like Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb go 3-4 turn. You can get Dak at 5-6 turn. That 5-6 turns like nice to get an elite quarterback. So I like to mix it up that way. The one thing I won't do is like kind of middle it where I'm taking like 5 to 6 running backs, like 1 to 2 early. I just don't see the upside in that. So that's my main thing. And going to quarterback, it does seem like there's more higher upside guys later, and I think the rookies has to do with that, getting Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields, Zach Wilson, and Trey Lance, who we like a lot and are well above ADP right now on him. Like these guys have legitimate upside.
Mm-hmm.
And in best ball, you don't really care that they're not going to start out of the gate. You've got a quarterback that's going to cover you for a few weeks. You want to hit that upside throughout the year. And hopefully if you advance, you'll have it for the whole 3 weeks of the tournament.
Yeah. Justin, I'm curious, like if we think that a lot of people are going to go with this 4 running back build this year, can we have lineups where we take a lot of running backs and maybe we take a lot of them late? Like let's say you start your draft, I don't know, like Steph Diggs, DK Metcalf, CeeDee Lamb, DJ Moore, like 4 beast wide receivers out of the gate. How many running backs can we possibly take there? I don't want to end up with like 7 running backs, I don't think, but what other kind of allocations? Go ahead, Leone.
Oh, sorry. I know it was for Justin, but the 0 running backs early, 6 or 7, had really strong win rates last year. And now I do think the people that are doing that are generally sharper drafters. So I think there's some bias in that, but there were only 168 teams that did the 0 early, 7 total running backs last year, but they won the league 12.5% of the time, had a really good top 1% rate, even had a good top 3 rate in the league. So I think if you draft 4 wide receivers in the first 6 rounds, like you could get away with maybe 7 or 8 and then get a lot of running backs.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about last year is how many of the kind of top 4 running backs got hurt and kind of ended up just in a wasteland. And that allowed the people who were in the late of the draft, because the people who are doing the 0 RB are the ones who probably started with a Devontae Adams or a Tyreek or something and then brought it back with another wide receiver or a Kelsey. And so I think there is a little bit of a bias there where it's like, hey, if you just didn't waste your first round pick, your win rate goes up. I'm not sure I can honestly stomach not grabbing a running back in those first kind of 5 rounds and going with this strategy, because I think like, hey, the first week is just as important as I guess the 13th week, which is the last week of the regular season this year. And so you just can't afford to take those zeros. If we're talking, a season long strategy, I think it's a little different. But here, like those points really do matter. And so I'd probably be more inclined to say like, hey, if I got like a first overall or one of those kind of top 3 or 4 picks, grab my running back and then not grab like any for a while, I'm more okay with that, because I think there's a decent chance that your late running backs, you can kind of piecemeal it to be able to get a, or whatever our version of, maybe it's Zach Moss, maybe it's like our old school James White that was always going in those late rounds and can give you points. And then over time, your other later guys end up blossoming and they break out. But like you got to survive that early time period. And the way that I kind of think about, so I think in general, you see 3 main strategies that I wouldn't say are wrong. You've got the hyper fragile, you've got the 1 RB and then wait a while. So I don't want to either modified 0 RB, we can call it, or you have that just well balanced where you go with like the 2, 6, 7, 3. And I agree with Leone. That's probably the one that I will do the least of. And that's the one that we're going to see the majority of people doing. Now, whether or not, like, we're a bit in a bubble right now, we are seeing people doing probably this hyper fragile. And I think there's a little bias just because of what we put out there and the people that are drafting now. But I think overall, we'll eventually get to that kind of a 2, 6, 7, 2, and then throw on another guy at either the QB or tight end. And those are the builds that just they don't stand out that well, you're making a bet then on your players, which is fine. But over the long run, that's the least bet that I want to make. I want to make a bet on structure and finding edge and guarantees and stacks and such like that, not on a player profile.
Yeah. Okay. For more on positional allocations, you can head to the site. The article is up there. Leone also has an article up there with all the data he was just referring to about roster construction. I want to spend some time on stacking. So I'm curious how you think this format changes stacking at all, because one thing we talk about in DFS in the Millie Maker is that triple stacks maybe aren't as viable in the Millie Maker because you need to be perfect at every spot. It's such a massive tournament. You can't have just a guy be mediocre. So should we be doing more single stacks in this tournament? I guess the first question is, should every quarterback be stacked? I assume the question is yes. Anybody disagree that every quarterback on your underdog team should be stacked?
I disagree.
Okay.
I think you can stack a team without grabbing that quarterback. I think you can grab a couple of the Cowboys wide receivers early on, and maybe you don't end up with Dak because someone else reaches for him. I think same thing with any of those really expensive QBs. Because we have these late running QBs, I think you can still find ways to find value with your QBs and still invest in an offense as a stack. Because as we've talked about, this isn't weekly DFS where you need that QB wide receiver correlation when one scores, the also other scores. We're rather making a bet on a team over the long run. You can get Tannehill and Derrick Henry, even though they inversely correlate most, in an actual game situation over the season. If they both have, if the Titans end up going 14-3, so now we have 17 games, or I don't know what it is. But like if they end up having that great season, you expect they're both going to have great years. And yes, week 17, which is now going to be the final week of this, we should talk about actually the structure of the playoffs. Can we get into that?
Yeah, we will. Yeah, we will. Yeah.
Okay. So then there's going to be 160 teams, I think, in the absolute finals. So you still need that breakout game. You still need the big aspect. And that's where the stacking definitely helps. But once again, I think you got to get there. And in order to get there, you don't need everyone. Don't ruin your draft by reaching for a stack just because you feel like, hey, we have to stack every QB.
Yeah. Okay. Leone, I'm curious your thoughts on that. Also wanted to ask about the single, double, triple stuff, knowing what we know about the DFS. And we've talked about that before, Leone.
This is something I've become more aligned with Justin on as I looked at the data a bit more from actual teams. Last year I wrote an article on stacking that was a little more theoretical, and it was kind of a redraft in best ball. But as you look at the actual results, if you're sacrificing ADP value to get a stack, it's worse than stacking, with something that I found. Like you can sacrifice a little bit, but when you start sacrificing 1 to 2 rounds, and that's like composite stack too, that's not just reaching on one guy by a bunch. If you reach on one guy by a little, another guy, it adds up. You're sacrificing a lot of value, and that was worse than not stacking. And it needs to be out there that you don't have a dead team because you didn't stack. Last year, someone got, Tyreek Hill, Kelsey at the 1-2 turn, and they didn't get Kelsey at 3-4, or they didn't get Mahomes at 3-4. And they said to me, my team's dead. I'm like, no, it's not, for the same reasons Justin said. There's correlation with if the offense goes off, everybody does well. And the quarterback itself, there's ways to manufacture those points elsewhere, especially if it's going to be like a really expensive pick. And we even did this in DFS at times last year. If you had an offense you wanted to stack that had like 2 8K pass catchers and an 8K quarterback, we would take a 5K rushing quarterback and play the 2 8K receivers. That 5K rushing quarterback, it exists for us this year in Trey Lance and Justin Fields. We have access to that. So I do think that's okay. If you take 3 pocket passers kind of late though, that's where I really like to make sure I'm stacking those guys that don't run at all. And that's what Justin did on his team that won last year. So if I'm taking the Matt Ryans, I really want to stack. If I'm taking, Burrow has some rushing upside, but I want to stack. If I'm taking Brady, I want to stack. So the thing with all this is you have to be like, each draft is dynamic and you have to think on your feet and just try and feel what's reasonable, but you're not stone dead because you don't stack.
One thing I'd recommend to people is instead of doing the fast drafts, do the email drafts. I think you have like 6 hours to pick or something like that. And you can actually think about your strategy. I mean, I get flustered on the clock. You have 30 seconds and, I'm not thinking in a redraft league, I would just be thinking, what's the best player? In this, there's so much more thought that goes into it in terms of structure and strategy. And so sometimes I think it helps to have more time through the email draft version. But anyways, Justin, are you going out of your way to make singles or doubles or triples stacks, or how are you thinking about that? Are you just seeing what ends up? And obviously, like a lot of the late round wide receivers are easier to match up with your quarterbacks. There's not as much competition for them.
I'm more willing to go out of my way late in the draft. Early on, I will rarely give up my ADP. We are, it's just far more optimized from an ADP stance and more accurate in those early rounds. But the difference between wide receiver 50 and 60 is negligible, and we're rarely going to get that actually correct. And I think when we actually get into the aspects where we talk about how do you find a way to be contrarian, that's a great way to do it with your round 18 pick and such. And we could talk about, but in general, I don't mind reaching a round or two when I'm already past that 14th, 15th round, because I think in general, those wide receivers, the running backs, their range of outcomes are all very similar. Yeah. And I then just care about getting that stack. But I'm not reaching in those early rounds for their Q. And one thing here, which I think is a bit interesting, is I'll rarely ever reach for a QB, because a lot of times people are like, hey, I've got Michael. I grabbed CeeDee Lamb. I grabbed Amari Cooper. I'm going to make sure I reach around early to get Dak. Well, the thing is, who else is going to want Dak? Yes, someone can take him, but in general, people who want Dak, they want to have a stack already. So maybe if someone grabs Zeke, they might, but like a QB is actually more likely to fall if his stack partners are already taken on your team, because it's less likely someone else is going to reach for him above ADP when they're not reaching for him for a stack. So that's something to keep in mind, where you can really actually get some strong value, even like a round later than ADP, just because you're the only one who's actually benefiting from that stack because of players you already have.
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned about being unique, and obviously in a tournament this size, it helps be unique. In best ball, it's different than what we talk about in DFS. In DFS, you might be able to find some good players at 1%, at 3%, at 4%. In this, all the good players are going to be drafted, every single one. Now, one way to be unique is with some late round stuff and late round stacks and stuff like that. I think, I don't know, like Ryan Fitzpatrick and De'Ami Brown, or Jameis Winston and Traquan Smith, or Sam Darnold and Terrace Marshall. Like, these are all late round stacks that may not even be on a team. These guys might not even be on a team, let alone their stack on a team. So that was one idea I had. I'm curious what you guys think about that. And Justin, how important do you think it is to actually have a unique team when you get to the playoffs? Is that something we should even be thinking about?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. And I think it's more important, though, the month before the season starts, because we may now be drafting someone who has an ADP outside of 213, which means they're rarely getting drafted. But they have a good offseason, and then they're getting drafted by all these teams. And what we thought was contrarian is not actually that contrarian. And so the risk that we're taking to find this contrarian, if that player, not only are we making a bet that that player is actually going to do really well and shine, we're making a bet that it's going to happen after the offseason and later on. So like, it's just not the greatest bet that I want to make. But right before the tournament, right before the season starts, or when this tournament's close to filling up, that's when I'm like, okay, who are the players who have not been drafted at all that still have a strong range of outcomes that can be, a strong ad there? And normally those are the very late wide receivers who are stacked with my QBs. Occasionally the running backs. A couple of years ago, I had probably 30% of Chase Edmonds because this was a situation like before he broke out, but it was like, hey, I think with David Johnson, if David Johnson gets hurt, like that's an offense I want to have the running back for. And so there's still some upside there. I've moved a little away from that because people have caught on to it and brought him in, and it goes against the hyper fragile build. But like at the end of the day, there's value to, if you can be the only person, if you can get like a James Robinson, who's not getting drafted by much. I think he got drafted by less than 1% of teams. Mike Davis was around less than 10%. Having those not only helps you win your league when they break out, but when you hit the playoffs, you have a unique player that if they have a big game, likely no one else will.
Yeah. Any thoughts on these late guys, Leone? I mean, there's some guys that, and I understand what Justin's saying. Like, we could take Eskridge or Herndon now and be one of the ones to have them, but by the end, a lot of people might be drafting Eskridge or Herndon or Chuba Hubbard or Ahmed or something like that. Any thoughts on these how to be unique stuff?
I just would caution people against doing stupid things early in the draft because they think they're being unique. That's something I've heard people, even sharp people, kind of say like, oh, what if I take, this back that's going at the end of round one? What if I take him at the fourth pick and like and you just end up having the same combination as other people just with the worst team overall. Like everyone's going to have those combination of players. To Justin's point, the way to get unique is to get guys that aren't getting drafted, and you do it when the opportunity cost is really, really low at the end of drafts.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about money time, the playoff weeks. So in this format, regular season is weeks 1 through 14. So you have to win your league that you drafted against. Go ahead, Justin.
Top two.
Top two okay.
This year. Yeah,
top
it's
two
interesting.
Are advancing. Okay, top 2 are advancing this year. Then you have to win your. I assume you have to. You don't have to win. Justin, maybe you're better off explaining.
It's a weird one, and one of the things that we always talk about, like you got to pay attention to the rules because to get to the finals, they got to make it weird. But you got to finish top 2 in the first round.
Okay.
Then the next one, I believe you go against 18 people, and so 17 others, and you have to finish top 2 again. You advance to that, you now go against 17 again. You have to win that one. And then you advance to the finals, which I believe is then 160. And first place there is $1,001,000.
Got it. Okay. And remember, 18-week season this year. So championship week is week 17. I'm not sure if you guys think that has any impact or whatever. Now, I think what people are going to ask is, hey, can I prepare for this? This is obviously really unique. I mean, it takes an outlier scenario to have a team that spikes in week 15, 16, and 17. Leone, any thoughts on how to handle these playoff weeks? Can we draft with these playoff weeks in mind, or is that getting into FPS?
I think it's a little bit FPS. I mean, maybe if you notice a schedule alignment where there's 2 teams you like to stack anyways, you might put a little bit more priority to stacking the second team if it looks like you're going to get the first team. I haven't looked. We don't even have the schedule yet. I was going to say I haven't looked at it yet. We don't even have it yet to look at. So I don't have to feel guilty about not doing that research yet. But for the most part, I'm just so focused on getting my teams out of there that I'm trying not to do too much. The unique player thing I'll do. Maybe I'll put a little bit more emphasis on stacking than I would in a normal league. But my main focus is just making it to those tournament weeks versus trying to build a team that I think's like uniquely qualified to win those specific weeks.
Right. Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, there is one thing that I will add here. I agree that it is not smart for us to try to prognosticate into the playoffs and think, oh, that's not a good defense, so I'm going to choose this team because they have a good schedule, because we're not good at that. What we might actually be decent at is an individual game. And so specifically that final championship week. If you can find 2 teams that are going against each other, maybe it's indoors, maybe it's just 2 high-powered offenses, and you think that game's going to be a shootout, there is value to trying to get a stack of that game. And now, what I did last year was Chiefs and Falcons. And I specifically said, like, hey, I think this game has a chance to be a high-scoring shootout. And so on my team, I had Matt Ryan, Calvin Ridley, and then Travis Kelce. And doesn't make sense to have both QBs in that game because you can only get one. But if you can find some small correlation there, it's a long shot just to get to that championship. But you're going against 159 teams and it's $1 million up top. This is a very top-heavy prize pool. And actually, it's a little different than last year. Last year was a bit more flat. But because it's so top-heavy, I do want to try to optimize for that last week. So when this playoff comes out, I'm going to do an assessment. I'm going to say, like, hey, these are the games that I want to target. And again, I'm not going to give up my entire draft to reach to make all this happen, but I'm definitely conscious of like, hey, these 3 games that if I'm starting to get one of these stacks, I might, make sure that I throw in another player from that other offense and just try to optimize for that situation. And Chiefs, Falcons wasn't the biggest blowout. It wasn't like the biggest kind of shootout or anything, but I think the process was still strong.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. And a lot of that stuff, again, if you're doing the email draft rather than the on the clock draft, I mean, you can really think through a lot of that stuff cleaner, I think. Okay. This is awesome. I think this is actually at least half of winning is going to be with this macro strategy stuff that we talked about here. Obviously, Silva and I are going to talk a ton about the micro stuff and which players we like, which players we think are overvalued and undervalued. And I think all that stuff is super valuable too. But without the structural stuff, I think it's really, really, really hard to win. So this was awesome. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, check out the rankings. Justin, tell the people where they can find your stuff, what you're working on, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. Easiest way is just on Twitter at Justin Herzig. Most of my time over the next couple months with regards to best ball is going to be putting out some, me just doing some drafting and figuring out like, hey, what can I learn from last year and start adapting it this year and then share with all of you. So we'll be putting out some good content with the draft kit and always on Establish the Run.
Cool. Leone, what are you working on, buddy, besides just nerding it up with your TI-82 and Protractor?
Nerding it up, making sure these best ball rankings are all in order. The draft kit comes out May 10th, so we'll have rankings for all formats. If you're playing NFFC, FFPC, if you're getting into the redraft streets as well, we'll have rankings tailored to those specific contests. So it's going to be a fun drafting season.
Indeed it will. Okay. This is awesome. Again, if you're depositing on Underdog, promo code ETR after you deposit. And then if you get your draft kit after that, we may have a little special surprise for you. Stay tuned for that. We'll be back next week to talk about some rookie landing spot fallout, which I think will be very, very interesting. For producer Luke, for Leone, for Herzig, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.